We want to get in that place on a regular basis. And this is actually a problem that we all face in reality as human beings. Again, going back to this idea of us being the center of our visual universe, it sets us up to believe that in fact that's reality, that we're in control, that we should be in control. And what we see in modern humanity is more and more as we grow in our knowledge, as we grow in our ability to master the world around us, as we grow in the power to connect with each other through various forms, we grow in a sense that we are in control, yet we are becoming unmoored. Now that's an old word, so I want to explain what it means to be unmoored. A ship comes in from the ocean, it comes into port, and they moor it, they tie it to the dock. And it's very dangerous in a storm if a ship becomes unmoored, it could drift off to sea into the waters of chaos and destruction. And what we have is this internal sense growing, I find, in humanity. We see it, frankly, in a very literal way on our streets in our country and countries across the world, where humanity has a sense of being unmoored. And I think a lot of it has to do with these strengths or weaknesses, as you want to call them, of the millennial generation and all of us, that we're facing these unique problems that are impacting our lives. The more we divorce ourselves from the natural order, oddly enough, the more we become masters of the natural order, the more we begin to feel unmoored. Those are going on at the same time. It's really kind of poetic that we have a tropical storm hitting Texas right now as we speak. And that's going to do damage, and there will be flooding. But you realize 100 years ago, every storm that came through did damage. Every major storm that came by would damage huge swaths of land. People would be homeless, and they would be hopeless, and their lives would be ruined forever. And more those problems are being shrunk and constrained to major events, hurricanes, earthquakes, this little thing that comes up every now and then called a pandemic. You may have heard that word before. And so we go through these problems that every now and then remind us that we're not in control, even though we in many ways feel like we're in control. And you do realize that other than this pandemic coming along, this was the safest period in human history. That's a statistical fact, that more people were dying from diabetes than all the violent crimes, all the wars combined on the planet Earth. You wouldn't know that if you're watching the news, because you'd feel unmoored if you watch the news. That's the news' job, right? You understand that. The news' job is to make you scared, worried, and afraid, and mad so that you watch more news so they can sell more advertising. That's part of why we're becoming more and more unmoored, even though we're exerting more and more power. But every now and then we get reminded that we don't have the power we think we have. And as we grow in these apparent connections, we'll call it through technology, it's getting harder and harder to talk about what it is, because it's no longer an act of the telephone. The telephone's waning, waxing or waning, I forget which, and it's shrinking in its exertion over our lives, but more and more it's not even media. Media is shrinking in its power over our lives, but then we have the internet and social media and all these other ways in which we feel connected, where we're gaining knowledge, we're gaining power, it feels like, but paradoxically we're still growing in this sense of coming unmoored. And we can see it as we see growing rates of the diagnosis of almost every category of mental illness in our culture. It's not a judgment on those who have mental illness. It's just a statement of where we're at. It's a challenging time to live. We feel unmoored, even though, in fact, we are less likely to be killed. We are less likely to die of many things than we were years ago. Why? Because we all need to live in a universe where God is enthroned in the heavens. What is going on concurrently with all these issues that I've been talking about is that we as a culture, we as a people, have dethroned God. We have consistently and persistently taken God from his throne and put ourselves there. And I've explained why. This is not a judgment where I'm pointing at other cultures and other segments of our society and claiming I'm better than them. It's where I'm acknowledging why we do this. It is our nature, our sin nature, to do this, to dethrone God and enthrone humanity. And you see it writ large in our culture. It's just a natural way that things progress. And so in our time, we worship ourselves, our needs, our rights, our desires. We worship our rational minds. But why aren't we then rising up in rational joy and happiness? I haven't seen it. It's not happening. Why, as we become more rational? Why, as we exert more control? Why, as we become more aware of who and what we are, we're not rising up happy, rather we're declining into emotional dystopia? Why? And the answer is the same answer it's always been. Selfish self-centeredness is the root of our problem. Millennials did not invent this problem. We all did. And so we're all millennials. Going all the way back to Adam and Eve, the very first generation. If you haven't figured it out by now, let me make it perfectly clear. My first point isn't actually that we're all millennials. That's just the hook, right? The first point is that we're all sinners. It's been the first point of every sermon on these Songs of Ascent. We're all sinners in need of a Savior. I would add to that the first sin is pride. Let's move on to the second verse of our reading. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their masters, as the eyes of a maidservant to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he has mercy on us. I don't know if that connects for you. You've never been a servant. It's got some odd feels to us. It's an interesting way of talking about things. I think about our culture, where we have a world in which young people have all these opportunities in America. They are facing certainly financial obligations, and pandemics are certainly having an impact on their worldview. We certainly see inequities that need to be addressed in our culture. There's no denying any of those things are true, and I think we need to address them as people. But it is interesting, just as an observer, to note that many of the people who are the most upset in our culture today are young people who are going to college or recently graduated. They represent American middle class people, which means that globally they're in the upper class, that they're in the top 3% in the world economy. Yet during the season where they have an opportunity to set aside time to study, to socialize, to grapple and grow in their ideas, to focus on bettering themselves, they find themselves focusing instead on the problems they face and the oppression that exists in the world. And this manifests itself in discussions about power structures. And I've got to warn us that this isn't new. These ideas have been around before. We've been in this very place in our country before. And so the focus on the future becomes an assessment of who controls the power bases of our culture, and then the tearing down of institutions that may or may not be inherently oppressive. That during this academic training, many of our culture have embraced the ideas of Marxism and the Marxist dialectic of power. I want us to be careful here. Very careful. For Marxism, from its founding, has been anti-Christian. Let me say that again. Marxism, from its founding, has been anti-Christian. The power dialectic form of approaching culture demands, in fact, that we set classes of human beings up and against one another with the goal of overturning oppressive systems that do exist, not denying this. And somehow, in the process of overturning the institutions and systems of culture, we will attain rights being equally met. And in that kind of context, I want us to rehear what King David writes. I look to God like a servant looks to his master. That's radical sounding in that context, isn't it? There's a reason why Karl Marx rejected God. I want to pause there a minute and give you a little illustration. Help us see this, because many of us have not. Now, y'all know I was a room service manager, busboy, room service server, all of those things, background. Every now and then I get called up to the big leagues. And the big leagues in the hotel environment was the 5-star dining experience. At the restaurant, we called it the Trillium. Trillium's a flower, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. And in the Trillium, you would sit down at a table. It was a Russian setting. How appropriate is that? And you would sit down at a table, and you would have more pieces of silverware on the table than the fingers of one hand. Almost as many as the fingers of two hands. You'd have about 7 to 8 pieces of silverware. It was ostentatious at its extreme. And a person would sit down at the table and they would expect to encounter 5 to 7 people meeting their needs throughout the dining experience. You would have the lead waiter or waitress. You would have the sommelier, who was always the coolest person in the restaurant because their name was sommelier. They would come and help you with your wine selection, your champagne selections, guide you through what went with the meal you were eating. There was someone that was either called the second waiter or the backup waiter, and they're the one that did all the running back and forth to the kitchen and getting things. There would be a busboy that would help you with your table. You would encounter a host or a hostess, and then you would encounter the manager of the restaurant. This would happen for every table in the restaurant, no matter the number of people sitting at it. You would have this size of a team overlooking your dining experience. And for the lead waiter, this often was an opportunity for them to not watch the eyes. Don't ever look at the eyes, Coach says, but the hands of their guests. And if the hand moved to a dish but then came back without doing anything, that's a signal. They're done. Remove the dish. Get it out of their way. If someone picks up a cup and takes it to their lip and looks at it and doesn't drink and sets it down, it needs to be refilled. You're already too late. That cup should never get empty. You wash the hand, and if the hand goes up in the air, that is critically important. And everyone, whether it be the busboy or the waiter, knows somebody better get there immediately. And so when King David says of God, I watch your hand. And notice he uses the male and the female. This goes for everyone. I watch your hand like a servant. I act upon your will. We're losing sight of that. Certainly in our culture, but even within the church. That the primary purpose of the Christian is not to have their needs met, but to anticipate and grow in knowledge of the desires and will of the Master of all things, our Father in heaven. Again, this is a king writing this. This is true for all of us. We should be seeking to watch his hand. Pastor Bill, how do I watch the hand of God? Well, you should be reading your word. Studying the scripture is certainly the primary way that the believer can watch the hand of God and see what his will is for you, his good and perfect will, which is your sanctification, by the way. Because God says, I am holy, therefore you be holy.